Thank you for doing this. You know, I guess one of the silver linings of Zooming these days is you'd be able to get people from afar instead of having to make the trek over here to the coast of Maine. And I'll just tell you quickly, the course that I'm teaching to the students is one in which it's called Applied Amphibian Biology. And it's for the students to consider amphibians in the environment that they're found in. And so we have Acadia National Park in our backyard, and that has given us an opportunity to look at amphibians that are, in one instance, impacted by salt from the ocean, and in another instance, amphibians that are potentially impacted by paved roads that are in Acadia National Park. So the spark for all this was there is a particular stretch of road in Acadia National Park that does not close seasonally because it has to remain open because there is some shared property with the town of Bar Harbor and the water division. And that particular stretch of road sees amphibians crossing in the spring because there are wetlands on one side. Mm-hmm. So we have been looking at that stretch of road, and there are plans afoot to redo the road in the future, and people at the park could speak to when that might be, but to include as early as possible in the planning process considerations for underpasses for the amphibians that they don't benefit from other paved roads in the park that are closed seasonally just because the park doesn't maintain, you know, the snow and all of that. Unfortunately, those roads open up April 15th, which is after the spring migrations for most seasons. So in a fortuitous way, the amphibians are protected from vehicle traffic just because the park has the gates locked seasonally, except for this. There's some other stretches, but this one particular stretch of road is open year round. So, you know, as I mentioned in my first email that I had heard you talk at a couple of NEPARK meetings about the work that you were involved with underpasses in Vermont and what needs to be considered and how that all came to pass with the Monkton project.
Sure.
Turn it over to you.
So as we're going through the presentation, feel free to ask questions to guide it in a direction that might be more useful to you. Okay. So I would just ask everybody to stay muted, but if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and jump up and down and wave your hand and talk to us, and we'll try to respond. First of all, I'm Jim Andrews, and I'm a coordinator for the Reptile Amphibian Atlas in Vermont, and I also have taught herpetology courses at the University of Vermont and other places. And with us today is a friend of mine, Chris Slesar. And Chris, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us. I'm Chris Slesar. I work at the Vermont Agency of Transportation. My role is Environmental Resources Coordinator. And that means I work with the biologists, the architectural historians, and the archaeologists at VTrans, working to basically deliver projects in an environmentally sound way. When I'm not working on projects, I focus a lot on habitat connectivity initiatives at the agency, and in particular, reptile and amphibian work.
All right, I'm going to start sharing a screen to a PowerPoint here, and start going through this presentation. But like I said before, feel free to ask questions as we're moving along. This is one of the underpasses here. There's two underpasses at this particular site. One thing I think that not a lot of people realize is that reptiles and amphibians are really the vertebrate groups that are most sensitive to road mortality. Although in terms of selling an underpass, in terms of the public relations for an underpass, finding funding for an underpass, I mean, I think it's useful to talk about the other species that come through that are kind of the sexy, furry megafauna like the bobcats and the foxes and the coyotes, but it's really the reptiles and amphibians that are most likely to disappear, populations that are most likely to disappear along busy roads. And then just keep in mind that it's not the road itself in most cases, but it's the amount of traffic on the road. And when you get enough traffic, you can get tremendous mortality. And then there have been plenty of studies to show that populations near roads often disappear over time as a result of road mortality. In Vermont, we have been fortunate to develop a relationship. The guy on the right there is Chris, even though he looks 10 years young, maybe 15, Chris, I'm not sure.
Well, I'm glad I look 10 years younger there because it's actually a 19-year-old photo. So I think if I'm doing the math right, it works in my favor that way.
Yeah, I was considerably lighter too, but this is a project where we were working jointly. And on the left, this is Steve Perrin, who's the non-game coordinator, who's retiring very soon for Vermont for Fish and Wildlife. And we're working on a racer project, which is a rare species here in Vermont.
You know, Jim, you pointed out that the reptiles and amphibians have a real challenging time. One of the big challenges for an agency is that a lot of these species are not listed like the racer is. So they're essentially relatively common species that have no regulatory leverage for an agency to kind of mandate a crossing structure.
Chris, you want to talk about this program? I think it's
a really helpful program. That kind of gets to sort of the long-term goals of culture change in an agency so that people are predisposed to having an open mind to provide accommodations for species that don't have the regulatory leverage. Jim and I and a couple other folks cooked up a training program a few years ago. Originally, it was designed to teach folks how to identify road crossings for wildlife, but it really turned out to have a lot of value in culture change and just getting the folks who are doing transportation design and planning together with biologists and their partners at the Fish and Wildlife Agency and talk about habitat connectivity issues. So we call it Highways and Habitats. And since we started in 2003, we've probably put, I don't know, over 200 transportation professionals through the training. And one interesting note is, you know, a lot of these people have retired over time, but a lot of the younger engineers and designers are now in management and leadership positions. So we have an agency that has a predisposition for understanding these issues. And if we're talking about making accommodations for wood turtles on a project, we don't have to start from scratch.
Notice the bear claw marks on that particular tree. We were talking about reptiles and amphibians, but we also covered mammals on that particular course. Some of the things we've worked on together recently, this was a racer project, which was kind of interesting. This was along an interstate in Vermont, and it was our only known population of racers. And VTrans or DMV wanted to build a truck weighing station along the edge of the road in the middle of their habitat. We found that the racers moved up and down the edge of the interstate using the grassy strips along the edge of the interstate. And we didn't want to interrupt the movement of that population. And so we created this, you can see on the right, clear cut around behind the area that was to be developed. And then with construction waste, we created dens. And so you can see in this photo on the upper right, you can see 3 dens that were created cooperatively between the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, which owned, fortunately, this piece of land behind the development site, and VTrans, and myself as a contractor. You want to say anything about that, Chris, that particular project?
The den sites were an experiment, and it was kind of a win-win situation. The contractor would have had to have paid to haul that material off site and then dispose of it. And basically what we had them do was just remove any of the rebar and any of the stuff that shouldn't be in there from the concrete. And we worked with Jim and Fish and Wildlife to waste the material right there on site at these artificial den sites. So it was an opportunity for creativity and experimentation.
And I think that's kind of an important thing to talk about, talking about the openness to experimentation, because a lot of these methods are new and they're going to be refined over time, and people are trying new things. And I think we have to keep that in mind, that we have to have an openness to trying new approaches to maintain populations along with transportation projects. The project on the bottom was a spiny soft-shelled turtle project where VTrans wanted to build a new bridge in an area that was the primary hibernaculum for this population of turtles and the Canadian population of turtles. And so we were studying how the turtles moved at different times of the year. And eventually, when the bridge was built, the timing of the bridge was very carefully controlled as to when the piers could be poured, and we were keeping an eye. We created basking rafts for the turtles when their basking habitat was temporarily removed, and that proved to be another successful program between Fish and Wildlife, VTrans, and again me as a contractor. You want to add anything on that one, Chris?
Well, it's important to note just kind of how the thinking has shifted over time. Originally, that wasn't necessarily a cooperative and collaborative project, but we worked through those difficulties, and it did become a collaborative and cooperative project that we can all be proud of. I think one other thing to point out is that the scale of projects that we're working on in Vermont are considerably different than some of the other states with these mega transportation budgets. Basically, what we're doing is we're modernizing the infrastructure we have, and we're not building new roads. We're not bisecting new habitat. So it really, it provides us with an opportunity to enhance the infrastructure that we have when we have the opportunity, and we're not really digging into new habitat, which is, I think everybody's happy about that.
And even though Chris talks about this being a relatively small budget, for most of us who are working on the biological side, the amount of money that we work with compared to an agency of transportation is nothing. And when the Agency of Transportation is working on a reclamation project somewhere, and they can allocate something like 3%, Chris, of your budget to this kind of mitigation, that 3% turns out to be more cash than most of us are used to working with that are trying to work with wildlife conservation.
And that I guess that sort of highlights the great opportunity that you folks have with Acadia. It sounds like there's a project coming through. So it would be to your best interest to plug into that planning process and development of conceptual plans, because that is an opportunity to leverage project money.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Chris, you were mentioning that there's experimentation in all of this because it's fairly new and you got to try something. For example, building the dens for the racers, how important was it to keep the momentum up that we did it once and it worked, so we should continue this, of say documenting that the racers used the dens? Did you have radio transmitters? Did you do follow-up to see that the racers were sort of following what you devised?
Well, our population in Vermont is so small. The last racer that we had a transmitter in was carried off by a red-tailed hawk back to Massachusetts. We don't have documentation of racers using that habitat. However, we're not daunted. Like one of the big I guess, goals for all of us is to have an infrastructure that accommodates the movement, the long-term movement and genetic exchange of wildlife over time as a result of climate change. And we're seeing a lot of southern species move north, and the racer is fairly common in Massachusetts, and it's incredibly rare in Vermont. But when it comes back, when it repopulates Vermont, it's going to come up along that interstate right of way and hopefully utilize that habitat. So there are reports of a couple isolated racers here and there, but our population is really small. Jim, you could speak to that more, I'm sure.
I'll speak to Steve's question in general. I mean, Steve, you kind of put us on the spot by asking specifically about that particular project. But if we were to talk about the Monkton Underpasses or the Spiny Softshell project, we do have monitoring data post-project from both those sites that shows how successful those projects have been. So some projects have worked out really well. This one, we don't, the racer project, we don't have a lot of positive data to show. Hopefully we will, but we don't now.
I use that as a case study just to generalize it of how important it is that, in terms of public relations, to afterwards, let the public know that what we did actually seemed to have worked.
Yeah, and that is important.
That's incredibly important to showcase the success stories, and also one of the things we need to do as transportation folks is assure our upper management that we're not asking for these accommodations on every project. So we ask for them on projects where it's meaningful, and then documenting success is incredibly important.
So to take you back to the amphibians in particular, why reptiles and amphibians are so sensitive to roads? Well, first of all, if you just try to think about the amount of time that it takes an amphibian to get across the road compared to a coyote or a bobcat, I mean, the Monkton site, we've timed some of those amphibians. It takes 5 or 6 minutes for those amphibians to go through the underpass. That's a long time to be on the road surface compared to the amount of time that a fox would spend or a coyote would spend on the road surface. The necessity for many amphibians of annual movement to go from their overwintering sites to their breeding ponds and then back uphill, back to their overwintering sites. And when roads go in between, they have to go across those roads if they're going to persist. So that annual movement, even though it's relatively short distance, is another reason that the need for annual movement is that another reason that they're put at risk. Long lives. I mean, some of these creatures, in particular turtles, but also you're looking here at a spotted salamander, which lives 20 and 25 years. The populations persist in large part due to the survival of the adults. And if you keep on knocking off the breeding adults, sooner or later, the number of young produced is going to be less than the mortalities that take place on the road, and the population's going to disappear. And then the limited ranges of these species in terms of recolonizing after disease, recolonizing after a drought wipes out a population. They have a limited range. They can't travel like the birds and the bobcats so far. And so these roads are more of an impediment and taking up a larger percentage of their range than for other species. And then the last point here is that we're looking at impacts on the population level with reptiles and amphibians versus individuals. I mean, it's certainly sad to see a dead deer on the road, but the number of dead deer on the roads has not cause declines in deer populations. They're handling it. It's sad, and it costs money, and it's dangerous. And Chris, you might want to talk about that a little bit, just in terms of the societal costs. But with the reptiles, amphibians, you can wipe out whole populations. You want to mention the societal costs?
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, briefly. I mean, when people think about wildlife crossings, they do think about the large mammals, the moose, the bear, the deer, the ones that can really do damage to a vehicle and humans. We regularly, I think we lose 1 or 2 people a year to moose collisions in Vermont. So it's a serious issue, and safety is primary. There are researchers out in the Canadian Rockies who have demonstrated that over time, incorporating wildlife crossings into a new road project, it saves money. It pays for itself by reducing those societal costs of insurance claims and lost time from work, and of course the the immeasurable cost of losing a life. So insurance companies are starting to take notice of that.
So one of the issues here that we in Vermont and anywhere else you really have to deal with is where are the really significant crossing areas that you have to pay attention to first, because you can make the argument that there are going to be toads on the road on miles and miles and miles of road, and there's just no way that we can really afford to put in underpasses or any sort of mitigation in all those places. So we really have to pick out the most important places for some sort of mitigation. So the most significant of the crossing areas, and for the reptiles, amphibians, I use this as a guideline. What is significant? Well, where rare, threatened, or endangered species are crossing, where concentrations of common species are crossing, or where there's a wide diversity of species. And then you have to add something else into that. Is there also mortality at that site? And we have sites here in Vermont that, as you guys do, that, that have 2 cars per hour. And yeah, some reptiles, amphibians are going to die, but it's not going to have an impact on the population. So where you have one of these top 3 factors, in addition to high mortality as a result of higher traffic rates, then those are the places that perhaps you really want to look at. Later, after making a couple mistakes, we started paying attention to one other factor, and that was the persistence of surrounding habitat. Are you going to put a crossing in an area that's just going to end up being totally developed on both sides? It doesn't really make any sense. If there's a chance of conservation on one side or the other of the road, so that population is going to persist, even with an underpass, then that's a more important area to be looking at. So I want to show you a couple of crossing sites here in Vermont that that might help you, I suppose, in determining some of your crossing areas. I use Google Earth all the time to try to figure out where logical crossing areas would be for reptiles and amphibians. In this image, of course, the satellite image is really helpful, but then when you can put on a layer of the topographical maps, same site, but with the topographical map, you can see that we have here an upland forested habitat, and here this is forested, but it's wetland. And here's the connector. This is a relatively small road, but we have thousands of amphibians moving across this particular connector, spring, summer, and fall. Here's another site that we have. Looking at it again, we see the forested connector here. Agriculture, you're not really going to see the connectivity there, nor here. You're not going to see much action. But here where we have the forested connector, we look at that with the topo map right here. Once again, we see the upland, forested, in this case, rocky as well. And this is a forested wetland area with many, many, many little vernal pools scattered across here. So this isn't going to have that. This isn't like having a single vernal pool and the numbers that would go to a single vernal pool. This is the equivalent of having like 30 vernal pools all along this area. And so we have hundreds of amphibians, actually thousands of a variety of species. And then this is actually the Monkton Underpass site. Chris lives up north here, pretty close to this site. And you can see it fairly well here, but better once again, when we look at the topo map, you can see the large swamp. And then along the margins of the swamp, we have all these little pools that are essentially little miniature vernal pools. And we have crossing really that extends from up here on the north to about here. Initially, when we looked at this, you know, we thought, well, it might be nice to put in what was it, 7, Chris, that we first started talking about was the number of underpasses, but we couldn't afford to put in that number of underpasses, and we ended up putting in, what is it, 2 or 3, Chris?
We put in 2 just because of the cost, and that sort of gets to the point of like needing to like innovate and be adaptive. You know, we were trying to raise money to treat 8/10 of a mile, and it was not realistic. And we got to the point where we needed to act, or we would lose some of our grant funding. I should point out that this project was really mostly my civilian life, raising money for this as a Moncton resident. But, you know, we talked to Scott Jackson from UMass Amherst, who was responsible for some of those first amphibian crossings. And he said, you know what, you do what you can with the money that you have. You might not have time to get it perfect. And so that emphasizes the need to be adaptable and flexible. Just to also dovetail with Jim's point about looking at the topo maps and red flagging these areas. One thing that we're working on with Jim and with the UVM Spatial Analysis Lab and one of our consultants is developing a predictive model for VTrans that we'll be able to share with the rest of the state. But really the idea is to come up with a predictive model that takes into account all of these pieces of the puzzle that Jim is talking about and raises a red flag so that when our biologists are reviewing a project at either the early scoping stages or conceptual plans, they can run that model and see if there are any red flags that say this is a potentially big amphibian crossing site. So that's a project currently in the works.
So at this particular site, we had gathered a fair amount of data up front, and we could show indeed that there were rare, threatened, or endangered species here. And in this case, the rarest that we had at that site was the blue spotted salamander. And these are some numbers that we got from a couple nights in 2006 and 2008, 367, 328, and that would have been in a couple hours of survey work. It also has concentrations of common species, 2,878 amphibians of 9 species that we counted in 2009 on the nights that we happened to be out there. Mostly spotted salamanders and peepers, but some wood frogs as well for common species. And then some other species, clearly a wide diversity of species. We had newts there, we had 4-toed salamanders. We had some green frogs moving in and out here. It's a different process for them. Pickerel frogs, leopard frogs, and American toads. So we really had all 3 at this particular site. We had diversity, we had abundance, and we had rarity. And the additional factor, we had the mortality. In April of 2006, estimates of more than 1,000 mortalities in 2 nights, compared to a site here in my hometown, Salisbury, that has very little traffic, a mortality of 10 on 4 nights. So way more traffic. It's just a 2-lane road, but still way more traffic and much higher mortality convinced the Conservation Commission of Moncton to move on that particular project. You want to address this one, Chris, or do you want me to do this? The timeline?
Sure. No, I think the point here is that it was a long time coming that Jim noticed the site using the topographical screening that he did, and then brought it to the attention of Steve Perrin, who's a Monkton resident. I got plugged into it when I moved into Monkton, and we started collecting data. And essentially, Steve and I were it's a pretty depressing site. Whereas like the spring, if you've ever been to a spring migration, it's really kind of magical and all the rebirth metaphors are in play. But at this site, it was really kind of depressing. And we started brainstorming ideas of what we can do to fix it. And we came up with the idea of raising money. This is a local road, I should point out. So there's not, I can't use any influence in a project because it's a locally managed project. But what we did was propose to retrofit the road with crossings and just spent many years raising money. The big turning point was, and this would be important for folks to note, is the big turning point was landing the Transportation Alternatives Grant, which is a grant program that most state DOTs administer, that mostly does bike paths, streetscape, and things like that. But there is a category for environmental mitigation and wildlife crossings that is rarely used, but still available.
So finally, in 2015, we had SD Ireland, which is a local construction company, began construction for us. And I think this is mostly your stuff, Chris. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. This is these slides illustrate the most expensive part of the project, which is the retaining walls, right? It's just dumb luck if you put a culvert in and the amphibians find it. So we needed to funnel the amphibians into the crossing structures. And we would love to have put these walls up for the entire length of the road, but we just couldn't afford it. And it came to about $30 per linear foot. And the engineering solution we came up with was to use what's basically waste concrete blocks. The concrete company has a little left over in their truck from whatever job they have, and they pour these kind of Jersey barrier type of things. We put them into the project basically like Legos. It was a fairly brilliant solution. A lot of the work there that you see there is putting under drains in it so that they stay in place.
It was important to me in that we were spending a lot of money on one of the first amphibian underpass in the state, that it would be seen as a site that did not require a lot of maintenance and cost over the long run. That once it was in, it was tough. It would last a long time, would not have to be revisited in the near future, and it was successful. And so I worked with the engineers to try to come up with, not just plastic fencing, but something solid and long-term.
That's a really critical point. Yeah, that the select board in Monkton did not want to take on any responsibilities for maintaining this. And so we came up with the most maintenance-free solution we could come up with. And there's just a couple more shots of the wall, but Jim pointed out it was SD Ireland who was the contractor. And I was surprised that they came in as low bid because they're a huge company, but really they're all about concrete. And they also had an interest in this project. So they bid on it. They came in as low bidder. They had a very small crew out on site, but they did a really, really great job. The resident engineer was very detail oriented. And you see the first of the culverts going in there in the bottom picture, and they're precast culverts. So SD Ireland cast them on site to our specifications and delivered them in pieces to the site. Another big concern was road closure. The town didn't want to deal with the road closure. So we settled for, I think, with those precast concrete, they were amenable to closing the road for, I think, 2 days. And I think that's all it took to cut that hole in and drop the precast culverts in and then patch it back up. And then for the rest of the construction, we used what's known as we just had traffic control. So one-way traffic with, you know, the guys or gals holding the sign, and they could do the work while the road was open.
So amphibians have been shown to move when you move better through underpasses that have a greater openness ratio. So as big a hole as you can make for these amphibians relative to the length of the tunnel. These were 5 feet across in the opening. And when we actually backfilled them, they range from about 2 to 4 feet high. And you can see that there are manhole covers on the top that allow airflow there and rain to get in from the road surface. And this was something that the local road crew was concerned about. They didn't want anything that the plows would catch on. And so we had to design this so that it wouldn't, nothing would really stick up so that the snow plows would hit them in the winter.
We really wanted to have a grate going all the way across, and that was kind of a non-starter for the town, and they compromised with the 2 slotted manhole covers, and we feel like they let in enough airflow and moisture. So back to the retaining walls, you can see in the top photo that it's backfilled so that it's flush to the top. If an animal gets up on the road, they can just drop down over the side. But if they're coming up from the wetland, they will hit that wall and be hopefully directed to the tunnel. If they make the wrong choice, Jim came up with these turnarounds at the end, and there's a grad student right now who's doing a study, a kind of a proper academic study of these of the crossing structure efficacy. And one of the big questions is, what do they do when they make the wrong turn at the wall? They turn towards the end of the wall instead of going to the culvert. Do they turn around and try to go back, or do they go back in the woods, or do they go up and over the road? Jim also had the contractor fill in any cracks in the wall, the spaces in between the blocks, with spray foam, just to keep the walls as impermeable as possible.
In some circumstances, they're actually building overhangs. And that would help with things like spring peepers that are pretty good climbers, or gray tree frogs that are excellent climbers. We didn't opt to do that at this site, but at some other sites, they are attaching overhangs to the tops of these walls.
In retrospect, if we had a little bit more money, I think at the end of the walls, it would have been awesome to put in a smaller culvert. Just another option to get across. Here's a view of the culverts in place. We put in some leaves just to provide some organic material that would hold some moisture, and that the amphibians could find some cover in there, and then a closer shot of the manhole covers. And I'll tell you what, it's if you're in that tunnel and a truck goes over that manhole at 60 miles an hour, it almost is like a vacuum effect. It is really startling the first time, but their primary purpose, the slotted covers, are to provide moisture to the substrate.
And it was important to me that we have natural substrate in the bottom. Some tunnels, they've had sand in there or cement in there, and we didn't want that. We wanted a substrate that would hold moisture, and we wanted local substrate. And then we added the leaves. And after we added the leaves, we even added cover objects, slate cover objects that are scattered through each of the tunnels and along each of the walls. So if predators start figuring these sites out, then there's cover for the reptiles and amphibians that are using these sites. Though I have to say that there really is no evidence of predators being drawn to these sites, to the tunnels or the walls. They are drawn to the road surface where the dead amphibians are. That's the easy prey. And we haven't had a problem with predation along the tunnels.
One quick note too, an engineering note is, in addition to natural substrate, the grade in the culvert follows the natural grade. So we tried to mimic the natural environment as best as humanly possible there. This is a view from the northern culvert, looking up from the wetland to the upland forest, and from our camera study, and Jim devised a pretty dang brilliant method of capturing amphibian movement. Most cameras are triggered by a differential in heat. Well, the amphibians or reptiles, there's no difference between their temperature and the temperature of the rock or the substrate they're on. So Jim programmed our cameras that first year to fire 1 time per minute from just a little bit before sundown to a little bit after sun up. And we got tens of thousands of photos. But when those photos correspond to a crossing night and we're scrolling through them, we can see and count the amphibians going through there, and they move slow enough where the 1 shot per minute captures a fair representation of the movement.
Okay. Chris, fundraising.
Yeah, I mean, we could go through this really quick, but the total project was $400,000, and it took a lot of effort, a lot of fundraising, everything from a bake sale at a daycare to transportation alternatives grants. So we had 2 big federal grants, some smaller local grants, and a lot of fundraising, including an Indiegogo crowdsourcing campaign.
On this picture to the left, you see this spotted salamander here. This spotted salamander just showed up. It's about 3-4 feet long and made out of wood and anchored to the ground. And we had nothing to do with that. Somebody just created a big spotted salamander and put it there at the entrance to the tunnels. And it has occasionally disappeared and come back. Is it there right now?
It was there this fall, last I was there, and it was facing the other way.
Okay. There's also some diversions that you can see in this picture that we added, so that amphibians and reptiles that are moving along the wall will hit these diversions. We made them higher. We extended them, hit these diversions and be directed into the tunnels. This is one of your projects, Chris.
Yeah, well, I just mentioned that the diversity in fundraising was everything from a kid's bake sale at a daycare to there's a local philanthropist that gave some money, and it was just anywhere and everywhere we could find donors. We twisted their arms politely, and I should point out that the difference here between a programmed project on a state route and this one is this was a locally managed grassroots effort rather than being tagged onto a federally funded transportation project. So this was a retrofit too. There was no paving project or anything to tag this onto. Just another slide of all, some, not all, some of the major partners in this, from federal highways to U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the town of Monkton and the Watershed Agency, the Reptile and Amphibian Atlas Project, Defenders of Wildlife, quite a host of organizations and agencies and individuals, and it took a long time.
So I want to talk about the amphibians just a little bit. You guys in the classroom, it sounds like you know your species. Wood frog is one of the most common species to show up in these crossing locations. It's moving from its overwintering locations in the forest, in the leaf litter, down to the breeding pools, and they're out of there. They're an explosive breeder, and they're out of there within a few weeks. They lay their eggs, and then the next rain, they start moving uphill again. And so that's a relatively short-term project, short-term movement down and back. Spotted salamanders overwinter underground at a deeper depth below frost, moving down to similar pools, and then that movement period lasts much longer. It lasts up to a couple months before those spotted salamander adults are all out of there and back up into the woods. Here we see a lot of blue spotted movement. I'm not sure whether or not you have blue spotteds at the sites that you're looking at, but this is a big blue spotted salamander site at the Monkton Underpass. What's different about the blue spotted salamanders is they do not necessarily move back up into the overwintering habitat in the spring. They may be down in the edge of that wetland all summer and move up in the fall. And so we saw, as a matter of fact, the first time we saw movement at this site and realized it was an important site was in the fall, when there was a big fall movement of blue spotted salamanders coming uphill. Peepers, one thing about these little peepers is that the males just don't give up in terms of calling. They're always hopeful that more females will show up. And so once they get down to the wetland, they keep calling for months. And so their breeding period extends over a couple months as well. But there are some more unusual salamanders that people don't pay as much attention to that are important migrating salamanders. And one of them is the four-toed salamander here. And then a whole different type of migration that sometimes happens is leopard frogs. And leopard frogs are terrestrial once they've finished their breeding season. And so they move about in foraging habitat, and that foraging habitat often crosses rows. And Chris has had to deal with really high mortality of leopard frogs at some sites. Chris, you want to talk about how you've tried to deal with that?
Well, there's a causeway up on in the Champlain Islands that goes through an incredible Class 1 wetland. It's a state route, and it gets a lot of traffic, like 10,000 by Vermont standards anyway, a lot of traffic. And it's smack dab in the heart of some really rich leopard frog habitat. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, we're not short of leopard frogs here, but we're central to their range. And when they start swarming on a rainy night in the summer, that road literally gets slick with dead frogs, and people freak out and try to stop traffic. It's so it becomes a safety hazard. We responded to that a few years ago with an experiment that Jim helped us cook up, just by putting construction silt fence up as a barrier to see if we could minimize the amount of leopard frog damage happening on the road. And it was really successful. And they didn't need to move from one side to the other. They were just swarming on a rainy night. So the goal was to keep them off the road. We did that for several years as a proof of concept, but it took a lot of effort to, and a lot of silt fence that ended up in landfills to treat like just 1,000 feet of that causeway. And the causeway itself is 6,000 plus feet long. So one of my goals is to try to figure out, when we have a project on that stretch or in that watershed, to leverage some money to put in a more permanent fix at this site. We have the proof of concept. We know it works. We just need to figure out how to do it for the long term, rather than putting up construction silt fence every year.
I'm going to try to pick up the pace here a little bit because I see we're using up some of our
Oh.
time. But gray tree frog can climb over most of your barriers unless you have some sort of a lip on the top. And they're also a late breeder. And although people don't pay as much attention to it, in many sites, redback salamanders migrate from overwintering sites to wetter lowland areas. Don't forget also that the young, once they metamorphose in the late summer, are going to be moving uphill in order to get up into the overwintering habitat. So there's movement that goes on much of the year. While we had the cameras in there, we caught photos of a variety of other species that are good for PR. The bobcat, you see, the rabbit here, the opossums, the porcupines just love these tunnels. And there was a little bit of romance that took place off in the tunnels with the porcupines. Skunk, bobcat again. Well, Chris, maybe you want to talk just briefly about this whole idea of fringe to Main Street.
Yeah, I think just briefly that when we started the project, it was a really fringe topic, and through the collective work of road ecologists who are trying to get the message out there, this has gone from a fringe issue to a mainstream issue, and the project has received Federal Highway Administration awards for environmental stewardship. It got a lot of press. It got some bad press to begin with, but we went global after we got that first transportation alternatives grant. Anyway, our efforts are paying off. We don't have to prove the concept every time.
Other issues that the amphibians run into, the stream salamanders, getting up and down streams. Here's a culvert barrier that could be addressed with this sort of a culvert, so amphibians could still move up and down streams, along with fish. Large mammal passage. This is a problem that Chris addressed. Chris, maybe you want to talk on this one too.
Yeah, really quickly, the plastic erosion control matting that is so useful in stabilizing a construction site is also really effective in trapping wildlife, and in particular snakes. So we took up the issue, and it took a couple of years, but to make a long story short, we've since changed our standard specifications at VTrans. So whenever we're using temporary erosion control matting, it uses the loosely woven natural fiber mesh. So it actually decomposes, and when it's on the landscape, it's not trapping wildlife.
Oop. Let's see, come on, baby. I'm going to have to show that in a different manner, which I will in a second. So to finish with the slideshow, we're going to show you a couple of real short videos, but to finish with the slideshow, you know, reptiles will persist or disappear depending on what we do. We have claimed all the land, this one species, and whether or not they persist depends upon us. Chris, you want to show your little video?
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, let's see if we can get that to roll. Can you see my screen?
I'm looking at you, but I'm not seeing.
All right.
Oh, here we go.
Okay,
Here
that's
we go.
much. All right, this is a video that well, it speaks for itself. Can you hear it?
Can't hear it.
Oh.
Can just see it.
Hmm.
Good looking guy though.
So when you go to share screen, there should be an option at the bottom of the checkbox to share computer audio.
Give me a thumbs up if you could hear it.
Can't hear it.
No.
So if you stop sharing first, you go
Stop
to-
sharing.
Yep.
Chris, maybe just stop sharing for a second. I think we were being told, we're given some direction.
Yep. So if you stop sharing for a second. There you
All
go.
right.
And then go to share screen again. And there should be a little checkbox at the bottom. It says share computer audio. You're gonna want to make sure that that's checked first.
Very good. Share sound.
There you go.
Teach a man to fish. All right, let's see if it works. I'm underground, in mouse burrows, under rocks, under logs. And in the early spring,
Now we have the audio, but not the visual.
and we get those first soaking rains, the amphibians come up out of the ground and they march in huge numbers on some nights towards the wetland. And now when they come down the hill,
One more
instead of
time.
walking up and over, third time will be a charm. Hang on.
Oh,
We're still seeing your email.
yeah.
Right now, I'm in the upland forest. This is where the amphibians spend most of their time. They spend their time underground, in mouse burrows,
Good.
under rocks, under logs. And in the early spring, when the snow starts to melt and we get those first soaking rains, the amphibians come up out of the ground and they march in huge numbers on some nights towards the wetland. And now when they come down the hill, instead of walking up and over the busy road, what they do is they encounter this wall. When they hit the wall, they walk along the wall, which leads them directly to our amphibian tunnel. These retaining walls or drift fence are absolutely critical to the success of these crossings. They funnel the animals directly into the tunnel. This is the south tunnel. And the migrating amphibians emerge on the other side of the tunnel, on the wetland side, in one piece, which wasn't the case in the old days before the tunnel, and they head to the wetlands where they breed. So this wetland complex, known locally as the Heisinger Swamp, is the other absolutely critical part of the amphibians' habitat. This is where they lay their eggs in these fishless vernal pools, and where those eggs hatch and the young emerge and then make the same migration march the other way back up to the hardwoods where they spend the rest of the year. So when we designed these culverts, we wanted them to pass amphibians, but we also wanted to build them big enough so that other animals, mammals, could use them. We've been monitoring them with remote cameras ever since. We use a time lapse where the camera shoots one photo per minute during the migration period, and we scroll through those and we can count the number of amphibians that are going back and forth under these culverts. So I'm here today to change out the cameras. We found that the older cameras give off a slight infrared flash, which was actually startling some bobcats, and we saw them in our photos turning around. These newer ones, loaned to us from the Nature Conservancy, Fish and Wildlife, and VTrans, do not give that. They're called stealth cameras. So the reason the Monkton Road site rose to the level of needing an infrastructure fix like this is the fact that this is a regionally significant population. The big problem here is that there's a busy road in between the two pieces of their habitat. If this road was just a dirt road, it wouldn't be a big deal. We'd lose some amphibians during the migration, but the population would thrive. With a busy road like this, we were finding that over 50% of the animals were being killed during migration, and that was with a crew of maybe 6 people out here on a crossing night, counting them, but also moving them out of the way of traffic. That wasn't sustainable. This is a super busy road, and it's not conducive to having volunteers out here on a dark and busy night. The cars just zoom by here really fast. This project was a true partnership. It started with a grassroots effort from a local conservation commission and a regional watershed group, but it leveraged some VTrans federal highways money through the Municipal Assistance Bureau. It got a transportation alternatives grant which really put this project in motion. After that, the project received money from U.S. Fish and Wildlife to support it, and then there were other fundraising, local fundraising campaigns. So it was a true partnership between state, federal, and local partners. The monitoring with these cameras that we've done for the past 4 years demonstrate that these culverts work. We've passed over 2,000 amphibians every year through these safely, back and forth. So hopefully this is an inspiration for other groups to get together with their federal partners, their local partners, their state partners, and find solutions together. Thanks for your patience, everybody, on
Yeah, it worked.
the technology.
Are you still sharing your screen?
I think I clicked stop share.
Okay. So, Steve, I could show you that video, the short video of all the amphibians moving through the tunnel again, but Chris showed you that in his video. Do we have time? Do you want to see that, or do you want to go to questions, or how do you want to proceed from here?
Why don't we do this, Jim? Why don't we take some questions and we'll see how long that goes. And then if we have time, you could show that video. Or if we run out of time, maybe could you embed the video in the recording and we could watch that? Maybe.
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, but maybe we'll open it up to some questions now. We'll just see how that goes. And I'll extend that to the Zoom people over at the park if you have questions in addition to the students. So I have one right off the bat, but I'm going to let the students talk. Wesley, go ahead. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay. So you said that this project was more like locally funded, or you had to do a lot of fundraising for it. And also it looked different because it was a like state project, not a federal project. How would things be different, or how would this project compare to something that was being done on a federal scale?
Well, I'll let Chris chime in here as well, but if there was a project, for example, we have a Route 22A in Vermont, which is a state road, and there is a project that will probably take place in the next few years to expand that road a little bit, or at least reclaim it, which is to repave it. And we have hopes of putting in underpasses for rattlesnakes at those sites. And I think that all of the cost of the rattlesnake underpasses would be covered by the actual contract costs, because roughly 3% of the contract can go to mitigation. So I think there would not have been any need for fundraising for a project like this, were it on a state road or a federal road, as long as you had support of the people at the state and federal level. Chris, you want to?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The Monkton Road project was on a local road, and we got grants, federal grants, but on a federal aid project that's on a state route that comes through the Agency of Transportation, rather than like this grassroots retrofit that we were talking about. That the project, like a reclaim project like Jim's talking about, could cost like, I don't know, $12 million, $14 million or something crazy like that. It's a lot of money. If there is a permit requirement, I believe that mitigation for that permit requirement can be way above 3%. I mean, the mitigation has to be done if there's a permit requirement. If there's not a permit requirement, that some of the funds from a project can be used to sort of enhance or environmentally improve that project if it makes sense. Does that help?
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
yeah. Other questions? Riley, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Sure.
So one of the initial things that just when I heard about this project that I was wondering about was how you make sure that amphibians use the tunnels, and the walls really answered that, and it made a lot of sense. But it also leaves the question of how do you decide where exactly you place the crossing? Like, is there any strategic, like, oh, this seems like it, yeah, is there any strategic reason for where it is, or is it just like an equidistant thing?
Well, we had a fair amount of survey work going on these roads on rainy nights in the spring prior to the design of this project. So we knew where most of the amphibians were crossing. And so we wanted to be in areas where there was already a great density of amphibian movement. But there were also some structural issues that we had to deal with. There were ledges in some places that forced us, we were unable to put barrier walls in some places that we would have liked to. And so we essentially traded that off and put longer barrier walls in places where we could, and shortened barrier walls in places where just engineering wise, it would have been way too expensive to try to do it. But I think the preliminary work is the important step here, is that we did the survey work up front to know where the amphibians we're crossing now.
Could I just follow up with that and get to my question that I was holding back on is, but I'm also taking away from your presentation that the road monitoring work of when the amphibians use the road doesn't stop in the spring, that it should continue through the summer and the summer rains, as well as into the fall for some species. So, there's always a big focus on the spring migrations, the wood frogs and the spotted salamanders. But I'm gathering that any kind of monitoring effort that we do here should continue, through the warm season that we have here on the coast.
You're definitely going to get the greatest bang for your buck in the spring, because that's when there's the greatest concentrated movement. What happens in the fall, I am trying to raise awareness of the use of these tunnels all through the active season. But, and as late as Thanksgiving, actually, we're still getting uphill movement. But it's not as concentrated, and you're going to see fewer species, fewer individuals on a given night at those other times. So if you really want to know all the amphibians that are moving through, then sampling those other times a year would be useful. But if you have limited time and resources, then you would want to concentrate on the spring.
Okay. Go ahead, Giorgio.
Yeah, I was wondering, to what extent do you have to consider like the aesthetics of your construction projects? Is that a chief concern of yours when you're building things like the snake dens and the underpasses? Do you have to consider how they look in the environment, or is that not something that a lot of people complain about or anything like that?
It was a concern of mine, and I think it's a concern of Chris's too, because that's a public relations piece of this. We don't want to put in something that people are going to complain about and say, geez, this is ugly, or geez, this has other negative environmental impacts that we're concerned about. We really wanted it to fit in pretty well and really not show up much at all and not require much maintenance, and that most people would drive right by it and never notice it. And if they did notice it, then it would not appear unattractive or unusual. Chris, you want to talk about that anymore?
No, I think what you said is 100% accurate, and yeah, aesthetics are an important part for public relations, and also just for putting out the best product we can. We want it to fit with the landscape.
So in terms of, since this particular project was largely community funded, do you come across issues with people just not caring about or actively disliking amphibians and reptiles and not wanting to support conservation measures with them?
Yeah, but that has changed over time. There was one instance where I was out there on the road all by myself, and some people can be pretty negative. And when we first started doing the monitoring, we would get heckled a lot. And I was out there one night all alone, and I could hear like the bass thumping on this vehicle coming up, and so I like got out of the road and avoided making eye contact, and the truck like pulled over into the wrong lane and rolled down the windows, and I'm thinking to myself, now I'm going to find out what it actually feels like to get hit in the head with a beer bottle. So I walked up to the truck and I was like, hey, how's it going? They're like, what are you doing, moving lizards? And so I thought, well, I'm not going to argue taxonomy right now. And so I said, yeah. And I had one in my hand and I showed it to the guy and he was like, oh, it's really cool. We'll be really careful. Keep up the good work. And he drove off. So the public perception has changed over time. And one of the pivotal moments in the project was at a select board meeting with the new select board in Moncton. The new select board was deciding that maybe we don't want to take this grant because I don't know why. But they were not thinking about not taking the grant. And I got a little combative, which wasn't helpful. And towards the end of the conversation, a local guy, it was a contractor, stood up in the back and he looked at the select board. He's like, what's the matter with you people? This is free money. It's coming into our economy. The people working on this project are going to come to your store. They're going to pump gas at your gas station. Like, if we don't take this money, it's going to go somewhere else. And the tenor of the meeting like turned 180 degrees. So yeah, there is public relations that needs to be done with this kind of project. And it's kind of fun sometimes.
And then you have another question, Riley?
Yeah, it was just to add to that, like back home where I'm from, quite close by, we also have a tunnel for the amphibians, and they also put up this huge statue of a frog and like some boards with information about the amphibians and why they're crossing the road and everything under the tunnel. And it's really nice because it's actually become this attraction now, and people would drive quite far just to see this huge statue, which I think is a really nice story.
Well, we've been working, the Vermont Reptile Amphibian Atlas has been working a long time in Vermont to raise awareness of reptiles, amphibians in general, conservation issues in general. And we have large numbers of people who go out and help amphibians across the roads. And of course, this year and last year, we didn't do anything organized because of COVID. And even though we didn't do anything particularly organized at these crossing locations, the reports I was getting back were like 20 to 50 people at some of these spots helping amphibians across the road. So we've reached a critical mass through public education. It took some work, but there really is a lot of support out there if you can nurture it and bring it along for a period of time, which, as we've done within the Department of Transportation, as we've done within Fish and Wildlife, cultivating partnerships and raising awareness. And I think that's all paying off. I mean, we're coming at it from a number of angles, and people are interested, people are concerned. I like your idea of the statue. We don't have a statue. We do have a 3-foot salamander, but that's about it.
I think it's just to put a finer point on that, it's really important that when we make a big public investment like this, we're doing it in a place where it matters. It's not just some frivolous idea. We're sad because some frogs that got killed. You know, it's not a pet project of the Conservation Commission. It has meaning for the entire region. Also, it's important to show that these things work. They work really well. So kind of coming at it from that common sense perspective helps.
Yeah, go ahead, Jasper, and then Riley.
So you all mentioned that there was a student who ran a study on the curved metal turnarounds at the ends of the concrete guide walls. I'm just curious, if you know offhand what the results of that study was, if there was any conclusive evidence that it really pointed them where they needed to go.
You want to talk? I can. Come on in. We got the student right here.
About that, yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Gorton. Currently, the study is still ongoing, and that aspect of it is still quite early. But my preliminary numbers are suggesting that it's about 17% that are going around rather than being turned around. But like I said, it's very early on in the study right now, so that could change. But that's what I've been finding so far.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. Thanks. Go ahead, Riley.
Oh, I was just gonna say that I thought the grassroots aspect of this project was really cool, and it made me very happy to see that little poster from the bake sale.
Yeah, good.
And so I would guess I'm wondering if you think that a project like this, although it might have been harder because you had to go raise all of the money to do it, if it benefited on the public relations side of things to do it as a grassroots thing, to like get that momentum and support from the community around.
I think it sure did. It was hard work, but you know, when we first got the grant, it was like that slide showed it. It went global, the story. But we also made Senator Tom Coburn's list of wasteful spending, and then following that, Senator Leahy called me and said, "Give us information. We were going to push back on this guy." So yeah, the grassroots effort was pretty phenomenal. It was hard work, but I think in the long run, getting people engaged, from like the bake sale kids to Indiegogo stuff, was really important. And Jim and I talk about it at conferences too. Right now there's a really big grassroots effort in California to build a crossing for the cougars out there. I think P22 is the organization's name. So yeah, encouraging other municipalities or local folks to take advantage of that transportation alternatives grant is kind of important to me and to Jim.
Chris, you want to talk about that little lobbying effort that you set off with some of the members of your department?
Oh yeah, let's see. Yeah, it was shortly after we made Senator Tom Coburn's list of wasteful spending. We got wind that that there was somebody in the Vermont legislature who wanted to have the project killed because of the bad press. And so I went into a panic. I was pretty upset, and I called Jim, and Jim sent out a signal to his network, and I was like, we have to like push back, because there is a vocal legislator talking to our Secretary of Transportation. Can we counter that? Jim made like one phone call or one email, and the secretary's email was just shut down. And I got a call from my director who said, go talk to Secretary Dill, Chris. And I'm like, oh God, this is not good. And he was like, look, I don't know if it was you or not, but do what you can to get these emails to stop. And furthermore, when we have a project like this, 50% of the people are going to hate it. 50% of the people are going to love it. But we made a commitment to fund this project. We're not going to go back on it. So that was kind of fun, and I'm glad it had a happy ending.
What was the bad press that you guys were getting?
It was Senator Tom Coburn of was he? I think he's passed away, but I think he was from Oklahoma, and he had this. It was called Wasteful Spending List. You could look it up online, and they would take all of these projects out of context and showcase them as wasteful government spending projects. And this one made that list, even though it was a completely competitive grant, and the money that we got was not coming from paving budgets. It was not coming from bridge projects. So it was a misinformed, as often happens, just kind of a broadside attack. And so Senator Leahy's office, I think there was another project on there about maple sugaring. Senator Leahy's office called me and was like, give us info. They're attacking salamanders in maple sugaring. We're going to push back. So I think that kind of negative press can fuel some people who are predisposed to it. I spent a lot of time in the Monkton General Store answering questions just when I got gas or went to buy beer or whatever from locals about the project. And oftentimes they would start out by joking about it. And I would say, no, look, this is what's really going on. And this is a regionally significant population. And I think the kind of the groundswell was towards public sort of stewardship of the site over time.
All right, any last questions? I think we're running a little bit over what I thought I sort of projected we would need you. All been really informative. I don't want to steal the show by asking the last question, but just real quickly, when you were mentioning how with COVID, there were still spontaneously people going out and assisting with the amphibians moving across the road. I know one thing, when you start thinking about involving the public and citizen science, whatever you want to call that, it can quickly multiply of all the things you need to consider. And one of them that I've heard about is safety while you're out there. Like, how do you ensure, especially if families, if you encourage families, how will you ensure, you know, that basically somebody won't get hit by a car? In Monkton, do the volunteers, or how does that work so that somebody doesn't put the kibosh? Well, we can't have that because it's dark, it's rainy, visibility may be low, so we just don't want people out there.
Well, we certainly discourage that where the Monkton underpasses are. We don't encourage that the public to visit that site, and we don't advertise it, and we actively discourage it. Actually, we have a variety of other sites where there's almost no traffic or relatively little traffic, and I have a list of those sites that I send out to people. Areas where they can go that are fairly safe. Some that I would consider family friendly that have almost no traffic. But in addition, I send out guidelines for safety. Everybody has to have reflective or light colored clothing. Everybody should have their own flashlights. Nobody should run. Actually, part of that is for the safety of the amphibians as well as the safety of the people. Yeah. Because the smaller, when you get a lot of people at these sites, the kids at least will focus on the larger megafauna, and the little amphibians can get crushed under their feet. And so you're trying to get them all to slow down and look, and don't put their feet anywhere where they haven't looked previously. But yeah, safety is definitely a concern, and we have guidelines that we get out to people, reminding them of that. I did just a few weeks ago. I sent out a safety reminder to all my contacts.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. All right. I think we have one last question. Can you do one more question?
We got plenty of time, or at least I've got plenty of time. I don't mind staying.
I don't mind staying either.
All right.
Yeah.
I just have a question about that study that's ongoing to see if the amphibians turn around at those endpoints. How are you doing that? Are you just standing there and watching and counting when they turn around, or are there cameras set up, or how is that survey working?
Matt, you want to take that? Standing around. He's just standing there at the end on rainy nights watching them.
Yeah.
I suppose you could put a camera there.
Yeah.
We haven't done that. All our cameras are hidden. They're all inside the culverts, but you could have a camera there.
Can I follow up with a really practical question? So when you're standing there on a rainy night, when do you call it quits for the night? So if it's a rainy night, do you just sort of, you know, make your peace that you're going to be out there as long as it takes?
No, you can't be out there as long as it, I mean, sometimes these movements are going to take place at 2 a.m, you know, like from 2 to 5 in the morning. And although Matt and some of these younger guys that I work with are more able to be out there later than I currently am, Most of the time when we're out doing a road search, we're just out for an hour or 2 hours. It's just a sample. And I suspect that Matt's not going to spend any more than 15, 20 minutes, Matt, standing there at the end of the turnaround. Yeah, he says that that would be about it.
Okay.
Just a
yeah,
sample.
Yep. All right, go ahead, Wesley.
I had a question going off of Steve's last question about safety.
Yeah.
So when you're giving out safety information for like people that are going out as families,
Yeah.
do you include information about like handling the amphibians or like safety information about the amphibians as well as for the people?
I did in that last safety email that I sent out. There was a section on amphibian safety and a section on human safety. But what we also have going on is that, like here in my hometown, we have educational training nights at this small road, Morgan Road crossing in Salisbury, and we meet everybody that comes. We go over the rules when they get there. We show them the different amphibians. We tell them how we're collecting the data and that we want them to transfer data to the people with the clipboards. You know, there's greeters and there's educators, and it's an educational event at this particular site, the Salisbury site. At other sites, that's not the case. I mean, there's no organizational event taking place at most of these sites, but here there is, and we're trying to get the word out that way.
I think we might be good, Jim.
Okay, why don't I just finish off with that video? It's like, what, it's 2 or 3 minutes long, and then we'll shut it off. How about that?
Great. Whoa.
These are photos taken every minute.
Oh my goodness.
And I think people don't really have an idea of the concentration of amphibians moving through here in 1 hour. And a visual like this,
Wow.
I think, is very helpful. And this visual is available to you too on YouTube, Monkton Underpass YouTube video. And that's it. I mean, it's just this solid stream of spotted salamanders, blue spotted salamanders, wood frogs. It looks like maybe one green frog or toad that was just sitting there for a long time.
Oh. Wow.
1 hour, 1 night. Photos taken every minute. All righty.
Impressive. Yes. Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time and your expertise.
You're welcome. I hope it was helpful.
It was very
Thank
helpful.
you, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jim. All right. Yep.
See you guys.
All right, then Jim, I'll just look for some way that recording at some point can be emailed to me or sent via shared Google folder or something, whatever. Yeah.
I'll get it going right after we close up here.
Great. All right. Thanks again.
Yep. Bye-bye.